June 1942. High above the Pacific, the sky appears empty, endless blue, calm, unchanged. A Japanese carrier pilot scans the horizon from his cockpit, engine steady, fuel already ticking down. His launch time was precise, his route calculated. According to every expectation, the enemy should still be searching. Instead, American fighters are already there. They rise to interception altitude without confusion or delay. Formations are tight. Positions are correct. No frantic scrambling, no guesswork. The encounter unfolds as if the timing had been agreed upon in advance. This is not the first time. Across recent missions, Japanese pilots have begun to notice the pattern. Task forces detected too quickly. Strike routes anticipated. American carriers absent when expected. Then suddenly waiting somewhere else. Weather and luck no longer explain it. Inside the cockpit, there is no room for analysis. Only a growing certainty that something unseen is shaping the war before aircraft ever leave the deck. When the pilot lands, the flight deck feels different, quieter, less confident. Because surprise, the foundation of naval air warfare, no longer belongs to him. And that loss will soon demand an explanation far beyond the sky. At the beginning of the Pacific War, the Imperial Japanese Navy believed that secrecy was its strongest shield. Distance, discipline, and mathematics combined to protect its operations from enemy insight. At the center of that belief stood JN-25, the primary naval code governing fleet movements, carrier operations, and strike coordination. It was complex, layered, and revised regularly. To Japanese planners, this meant security. To Japanese pilots, it meant confidence. Radio discipline reinforced that trust. Transmissions were short and controlled. Call signs changed frequently. Casual chatter was forbidden. Carrier aircrews were taught that silence preserved surprise, and surprise won battles. The system appeared airtight. Early victories seemed to prove it. Pearl Harbor, achieved through near-total surprise, shattered American confidence. Japanese naval aviation surged across the Western Pacific with speed and coordination that overwhelmed Allied defenses. British strongholds fell. American forces retreated. Carrier task forces struck and vanished into open ocean. From the cockpit, the war felt one-sided. The enemy reacted. Japan dictated tempo. This perception hardened into doctrine. Japanese naval culture assumed that secrecy favored the disciplined. American society, viewed through Japanese eyes, appeared open, inefficient with information, and ill-suited to sustained cryptographic effort. The possibility that the United States could systematically penetrate Japanese naval communications was not seriously considered. Complexity itself was believed to be protection. Pilots were never briefed on code mechanics. They did not need to be. Their role was execution. What mattered was outcome, and early outcomes reinforced belief in the system. Yet even during success, irregularities appeared. In early 1942, some pilots began noticing American responses that felt unusually precise. Interceptions occurred sooner than expected. Combat air patrols appeared at altitudes that matched Japanese approach profiles. At first, these were dismissed as coincidence, or as the enemy learning from defeat. War adapts. That was expected. But adaptation had limits. Japanese strike doctrine relied on tightly calculated timing. Launch windows, approach routes, and recovery schedules were synchronized to the minute. When American forces repeatedly reacted within those windows, sometimes before Japanese aircraft should have been detected, unease emerged. Individually, such moments meant little. Collectively, they formed a pattern. The Imperial Navy's broader strategy depended on decisive battle theory. Japanese planners intended to lure the U.S. fleet forward and destroy it in a single, overwhelming engagement. Codes were the invisible framework supporting that plan. If secrecy failed, the entire structure became unstable. No one openly challenged it. Japanese military culture discouraged questioning upward. Pilots were warriors, not analysts. Losses were explained through weather, reconnaissance failure, or enemy courage. Rarely was the system itself examined. Even after operational surprises, official assessments insisted that communication security remained intact. JN-25 had been revised. Any compromise, it was assumed, had been corrected. This belief isolated pilots from explanation. They experienced the war where theory met reality. They noticed when American carriers avoided contact until conditions favored them. They noticed when Japanese deception failed too often to be coincidence. They noticed when enemy readiness seemed to precede Japanese arrival. By the spring of 1942, as preparations quietly turned toward a remote atoll named Midway, confidence and experience began to diverge. The system still promised secrecy, but the results no longer fully supported it. And in that growing gap, suspicion took root, waiting for confirmation that would arrive not through words, but through loss. While Japanese pilots trusted in silence and cipher, the war was already being fought in places they would never see. The American advantage did not begin in the sky or at sea, but in intelligence rooms filled with message sheets, maps, and half-erased calculations. This was the listening war. Before 1941, U.S. naval intelligence had identified Japanese communications as a critical target. By the time war began, multiple cryptanalytic units were already operating. OP-20G in Washington analyzed strategic traffic. Station HIPO at Pearl Harbor, under Commander Joseph Rochefort, focused on operational detail. Station CAST, operating from the Philippines until its evacuation, contributed additional insight. These units did not fully decrypt Japanese naval codes, but they did not need to. JN-25 was attacked through pattern recognition rather than complete translation. Analysts studied repeated number groups, common operational phrases, and habitual formatting. Over time, fragments accumulated. When combined with reconnaissance, traffic analysis, and radio direction finding, they produced a picture that was incomplete, but actionable. Most importantly, American intelligence learned how the Japanese Navy thought. Operational habits mattered as much as words. Carrier groups followed doctrine. Replenishment cycles revealed intent. Even when code additives changed, behavior remained predictable. This allowed American planners to anticipate movements without reading every message. The breakthrough came in early June 1942. Intercepted traffic repeatedly referenced a target identified only as AF. Its importance was clear, but confirmation was needed. Midway transmitted an unencrypted message reporting a freshwater shortage. Soon after, Japanese messages referenced AF suffering water problems. The conclusion was undeniable. Midway was the objective. What followed was not omniscience, but preparation. American commanders knew approximate timing and force composition. They positioned their carriers accordingly. When the battle came, Japanese pilots flew into a situation already shaped against them. 4 fleet carriers were lost in a single day. To survivors, the defeat felt unnatural. American dive bombers appeared at the precise moment Japanese decks were vulnerable. Fighter cover was misplaced. Strike cycles collapsed at critical points. Official explanations spoke of chance and misfortune, but the pattern felt too exact. The listening war continued. During the Solomon Islands campaign, American forces repeatedly intercepted Japanese strikes. Radar explained tactical warning, but not strategic positioning. American carriers avoided contact when outmatched and appeared when conditions favored them. Deception increasingly failed. Japanese pilots felt the difference first. They encountered American fighters already at altitude. Patrols appeared along likely approach routes rather than directly over ships. Responses felt deliberate rather than rushed. The enemy seemed calm, because the enemy was prepared. By late 1943, American intelligence could often estimate Japanese carrier strength days in advance. By 1944, air operations were anticipated with unsettling regularity. Pilots did not know how this was happening. They only knew that it was. The advantage remained invisible by design. Pilots were never told. Commanders avoided discussion. To acknowledge compromise risked panic and further exposure. And so the system continued. Unquestioned from above, doubted from below. By now, suspicion was no longer fleeting. It had become a quiet understanding shared among men who had watched coincidence disappear from the war. And that understanding would soon be tested in the final carrier battles, where preparation mattered more than courage. For Japanese naval pilots, realization did not arrive as a single revelation. It formed gradually through repetition. The sky, once defined by uncertainty, began to feel predictable. Not for them, but for the enemy. The first angle was human. Carrier pilots lived by timing. Fuel margins were narrow. Navigation relied on dead reckoning over empty ocean. Surprise was essential. Yet increasingly, American fighters appeared where Japanese pilots expected empty air. Interceptions happened earlier. Altitudes matched approach profiles. There was no frantic scrambling, only readiness. Pilots spoke of it cautiously, in ready rooms, on night watches, not as accusation, but as observation. The enemy seemed to know when to wait. The second angle was tactical. Japanese doctrine emphasized long-range coordinated strikes. This assumed delay on the enemy's side, time to detect, time to react. That delay began to vanish. During the Guadalcanal campaign, pilots flying from Rabaul and carrier decks alike encountered American patrols positioned along approach corridors rather than directly over ships. The pattern suggested anticipation, not reaction. Radar explained some of it. Radar did not explain how American carriers positioned themselves days in advance. Pilots noticed that American task forces avoided battle when Japanese strength was high and appeared aggressively when it was not. Feints failed too often. Diversions were ignored. When missions were delayed or altered, American responses sometimes shifted as well. The third angle was leadership. Japanese pilots trusted command. Many had trained under the officers directing fleet operations. Questioning them was unthinkable. Yet explanations increasingly felt incomplete. Losses were attributed to weather, reconnaissance failure, or enemy numbers. These explanations did not account for consistency. Radar could detect aircraft. It could not predict carrier locations. Yet American carriers repeatedly escaped Japanese strikes and reappeared under favorable conditions. For pilots, this suggested foresight beyond technology. The fourth angle was emotional. Flying into combat believing in surprise required confidence. Flying while suspecting that surprise was gone required resignation. This did not weaken resolve, but it changed perspective. Losses no longer felt random. They felt confirmatory. Pilots continued to fight aggressively. Courage did not diminish, but confidence in the system eroded quietly. The war felt increasingly arranged. The final angle of this section was silence. No official inquiry reached the flight decks. Codes were said to be secure. The system remained unquestioned from above. Below, pilots adjusted psychologically, not strategically. They learned to expect interception. They learned to accept inevitability. By late 1943, many Japanese naval aviators no longer believed they were facing an enemy who merely reacted faster. They believed they were facing one who already knew. And that belief would sharpen as the war moved toward its decisive phase, where patterns would become impossible to ignore. As suspicion settled into experience, Japanese pilots began refining their understanding of the enemy's advantage. It was no longer enough to say that Americans were better equipped or increasingly skilled. The advantage felt structural, embedded into how the war unfolded. One angle was the enemy's composure. Japanese pilots noticed that American air units rarely appeared rushed. Fighters climbed deliberately, conserved altitude, and disengaged when conditions were unfavorable. Engagements felt planned rather than improvised. This composure suggested confidence rooted not in bravery alone, but in information. Decisions seemed to have been made earlier, long before aircraft came into view. Another angle was the relationship between technology and knowledge. Radar changed air combat fundamentally, especially at night. Japanese pilots accepted this. What they struggled to accept was how consistently radar seemed to be used at precisely the right moment. Radar provided warning, but it required direction. Someone had to know when to watch closely, and where. Pilots began to suspect that radar was the final link in a longer chain. Something informed patrol schedules. Something shaped interception zones. Something told American commanders where to place their strength. The next angle was moral, though it remained unspoken during the war. Japanese pilots were sent into combat without awareness that their operational plans might already be compromised. They accepted danger willingly, but not blindness. As losses mounted, some aviators felt a quiet sense of betrayal, not personal, but institutional. They had trained for a war of maneuver and surprise. They found themselves fighting a war already interpreted by the enemy. This feeling deepened during major carrier engagements. By the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Japanese naval aviation was already weakened by fuel shortages and reduced training. Yet what shocked survivors was not simply defeat, but the thoroughness of American preparation. Defensive patrols were layered. Engagement zones were established well in advance. Japanese formations flew into a system already aligned against them. Pilots later described the experience as flying into a mechanism rather than a battle. Another angle emerged only after the war. In memoirs and post-war interrogations, Japanese naval officers and aviators revisited these experiences with hindsight. Writers such as Masatake Okumiya and Hara Tameichi openly questioned how American forces repeatedly anticipated Japanese movements. Pilots reading these accounts recognized their own wartime doubts reflected back with clarity. What had once been suspicion gained historical grounding. The final angle was inevitability. Once pilots accepted that the enemy possessed foreknowledge, their understanding of the war changed permanently. Each interception reinforced the belief. Each failed deception confirmed it. Combat became less about outmaneuvering the enemy and more about enduring an opponent who seemed always positioned correctly. This did not produce surrender. It produced acceptance. Japanese pilots did not claim during the war that America had broken their codes. They did not have proof. What they said carefully was that the enemy knew too much, too early, too often. By 1944, coincidence no longer explained the pattern. And as the Pacific War approached its decisive battles, those patterns would culminate in moments where doubt vanished entirely, replaced by certainty earned through loss. By mid-1944, the Pacific War had entered a phase where outcomes no longer felt fluid to Japanese naval pilots. The balance had not simply shifted, it had hardened. What had once been doubt now solidified into certainty, not through confession or discovery, but through repetition. The decisive change was not a single engagement, it was the disappearance of surprise. This became unmistakable during the final carrier battles. In the Mariana Islands campaign, Japanese air units launched under severe constraints, limited fuel, reduced training, inexperienced replacements. Yet even allowing for these disadvantages, the manner of defeat felt different. American carrier groups were positioned with an accuracy that could not be explained by reaction alone. Fighter screens were layered where Japanese aircraft emerged. The response was calm, not hurried. Pilots described seeing American fighters already at altitude, engines throttled for engagement, as if the encounter had been expected. There was no scramble, no uncertainty. The sky felt claimed. Timing troubled them most. Strike groups that should have reached American task forces before interception were engaged miles out. Even when Japanese units altered routes or launch times, American defenses often adjusted in parallel. The enemy was not reacting faster. He was reacting first. Official explanations remained unchanged. Command briefings cited radar, improved American training, and numerical superiority. All were true. None explained why American carriers consistently avoided unfavorable engagements. Japanese planners attempted feints and diversions. Again and again, they failed. The enemy ignored what did not matter and concentrated precisely where it did. For pilots, the implication became unavoidable. Someone was reading the plan, not visually, not tactically, but at its source. Post-war recollections later captured what pilots felt at the time. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, later called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, was remembered not just as a defeat, but as confirmation. American forces fought as if the engagement had already been outlined. Japanese pilots flew into interception zones that felt prearranged. Losses mounted with mechanical efficiency. By now, doubt had ended. Pilots did not need proof. The pattern itself was proof. The enemy knew where to be. The enemy knew when to strike. Courage could not overcome preparation of that scale. This realization did not bring panic. It brought clarity. Japanese pilots understood that the invisible battle, the one fought in intelligence rooms, had already been lost. The air war merely revealed the outcome. By late 1944, many no longer believed the war could be turned through skill or bravery alone. What they did not yet know was how long this advantage had existed. That truth, that American crypt analysts had been listening from the earliest months of the war, would only emerge later. But even without that knowledge, pilots understood something essential. They had been fighting an enemy who already knew the shape of the battle before it began. And that certainty would deepen in the final months, as the last illusions of unpredictability vanished entirely. As 1944 moved toward its end, Japanese naval aviation entered its final stage. Carrier operations were rare. Aircraft were few. Fuel was scarce. For the pilots still flying, the war had narrowed to survival rather than maneuver. Yet even in this reduced form, the enemy's foreknowledge remained evident. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 marked the effective end of Japanese carrier aviation as a strategic force. Though complex in execution, the outcome felt familiar to those in the air. American forces countered Japanese movements with speed and confidence. Feints designed to draw carriers away achieved limited success, but the main effort was detected and neutralized. Pilots flying long-range missions encountered American defenses positioned with unsettling accuracy. Patrol zones overlapped. Interception altitudes were precise. The response felt prearranged rather than improvised. By now, conversations among aviators changed tone. The question was no longer whether the enemy was intercepting communications. It was how long it had been happening. Pilots did not know the answer. They only knew that the pattern stretched backward, past the Marianas, past Guadalcanal, past Midway. Late war missions reflected this loss of uncertainty. Operations became simpler, more direct. Complex coordination gave way to frontal attack. The war of maneuver had ended. What remained was attrition against an opponent who controlled timing and positioning. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, surviving pilots expected many revelations. They expected to hear about American production, radar, and training systems. What they did not expect was the scale of the intelligence effort that had shaped the war from its earliest days. Post-war disclosures confirmed what pilots had long suspected. American crypt analysts had not merely intercepted Japanese communications. They had understood them well enough to anticipate operations. Midway had been an ambush built on information. Subsequent carrier battles had been shaped by foreknowledge rather than reaction. For pilots, this knowledge aligned memory with fact. Moments that had once felt cruelly coincidental now made sense. The precise timing of interceptions, the repeated failure of deception, the absence of American carriers from expected locations. The enemy had not been everywhere. He had been informed. This realization did not produce bitterness. It produced acceptance. Japanese pilots recognized that they had fought an enemy who mastered a dimension of warfare they had underestimated. Codes and discipline had not been enough. The war had been decided quietly, by those who listened and interpreted. By the time the truth emerged, the fighting was over. But understanding remained. The war they had flown through had already been read. When the fighting ended, the sky fell quiet before the questions were answered. Japanese naval pilots returned not to explanation but to absence of aircraft, of command, of purpose. The Imperial Navy that had once carried them across the Pacific no longer existed. What remained were memories shaped by confusion and a growing need to understand how defeat had come so completely. In the immediate aftermath, there was no full accounting. Japan faced occupation and disarmament. Military records were destroyed, seized, or sealed. Pilots were questioned about training, tactics, and morale, then released back into civilian life. Few were told anything about intelligence failures. The war, officially, was over. Privately, reflection began. Former aviators compared experiences. The same names surfaced again and again. Midway, Guadalcanal, the Marianas. The same sensations were recalled. Routes that felt exposed. Timing that felt anticipated. Engagements that unfolded with unsettling efficiency. What had once been isolated doubts now formed a shared pattern. As information slowly emerged, those memories found context. Post-war studies revealed that American forces had possessed partial but decisive insight into Japanese naval intentions throughout much of the war. Pilots began to understand that what they had experienced was not misfortune or incompetence in the cockpit, but structural disadvantage. The emotional impact was mixed. Some pilots felt anger, not toward their former enemy, but toward a system that had placed absolute faith in secrecy while dismissing the possibility of compromise. Others felt relief. The sense of inevitability they had felt in combat was no longer personal failure. It had been the product of a hidden imbalance. Japanese naval officers, writing after the war, gradually acknowledged this reality. Figures such as Masatake Okumiya and Hara Tamechi openly questioned how American forces repeatedly anticipated Japanese movements. Their accounts validated the quiet doubts pilots had once carried alone. For many aviators, this brought closure. They no longer needed to search for unseen mistakes in their flying. The war they fought had been shaped far beyond the cockpit. Their experience of flying into prepared skies had been real. Silence allowed understanding. Pilots wrote memoirs, spoke with historians, and revisited battles with the benefit of hindsight. In doing so, the Pacific War became more than a story of aircraft and courage. It became a lesson in how information, once lost, cannot be recovered. And as the truth continued to surface, one final realization remained. This invisible war had not ended with surrender. Its consequences were only beginning to be understood. In the years following Japan's surrender, the final dimensions of the Pacific War emerged with clarity. What had once been hidden behind secrecy and necessity entered the historical record. For Japanese naval pilots, this period transformed suspicion into confirmation. American accounts detailed the scope of the cryptanalytic effort that had underpinned the war. Units such as Station HIPO, once anonymous, were acknowledged as decisive. The work of analysts like Joseph Rochefort and Edwin Layton was recognized for turning fragments of intercepted traffic into strategic advantage. For Japanese veterans, these disclosures were sobering. The Battle of Midway, long remembered as catastrophic misfortune, was reinterpreted as a calculated ambush. American carriers had not arrived by chance. They had waited. The loss of 4 fleet carriers in a single day was no longer inexplicable. It was planned. Other operations aligned with similar clarity. Deceptions that failed. Strikes intercepted with uncanny timing. Carrier forces that avoided battle until conditions favored them completely. Pilots recognized these moments instantly. They had lived them. American histories emphasized restraint as well as success. Intelligence was not always acted upon immediately. To protect the secret, American commanders sometimes allowed Japanese units to escape. This explained why the enemy had not appeared omniscient, only selectively precise. For Japanese pilots, this detail resolved a final uncertainty. Japanese official histories eventually acknowledged intelligence failure as a central cause of defeat. The Imperial Navy's confidence in complex codes and disciplined radio procedure had fostered overconfidence. When compromise occurred, it went undetected. For pilots, this completed the picture. Their experiences were no longer isolated or subjective. They were evidence of a larger collapse. The war had turned not through a single mistake or battle, but through the loss of informational control. As understanding deepened, memory shifted. Japanese pilots no longer described the war solely in terms of aircraft or tactics. They spoke of timing, anticipation, and preparation. Their recollections aligned with the historical record of a war shaped by listening rather than guessing. By the time the full truth emerged, decades had passed. But the realization remained clear. The battles they remembered had been only the visible surface of a deeper contest, one decided quietly, patiently, and without spectacle. And with that knowledge in place, reflection became unavoidable. The Pacific War is remembered for carrier decks, burning aircraft, and pilots climbing into the sky with fuel and courage measured to the minute. Yet beneath those visible battles ran another conflict, silent, deliberate, and decisive. It was a war of listening. For Japanese naval pilots, this truth emerged gradually. They felt it in the timing of interceptions, in the absence of surprise, in the sense that the enemy arrived already prepared. Long before official confirmation, the sky itself revealed that something fundamental had changed. What defeated them was not simply superior aircraft or greater numbers. It was an opponent who learned how to see without being seen. By breaking naval codes and understanding operational habits, the United States reshaped uncertainty into advantage. Battles were influenced before aircraft ever launched. Courage met preparation, and preparation prevailed. This realization did not diminish the bravery of those who flew. Japanese pilots fought with discipline and resolve under conditions that grew increasingly unforgiving. Their losses were real, their sacrifices unquestioned. What changed was the meaning of those sacrifices once the invisible war became visible. The lesson extended beyond the Pacific. Modern warfare would no longer be decided only by those who fought at the front. Intelligence, cryptography, and information control became as decisive as weapons themselves. The pilot in the cockpit and the soldier on the ground would always fight within a framework shaped elsewhere, by those who listened, analyzed, and anticipated. For the men who once scanned the Pacific horizon, the war's final truth arrived only in peace. The enemy had not been everywhere. He had been ahead. And in that realization lies the enduring message of their experience. Wars are often decided long before the first shot is fired, not by force alone, but by knowledge quietly gained and carefully used. The sky remembers the battles. History remembers who understood them first.